The DNA is telling us. Doing the Y chromosome work, I found that there was not a link between Richard III and the male line relatives who are alive today. King Richard III's story just took a shocking turn, and it is one that few were prepared to face. When scientists first uncovered his remains beneath a parking lot in Leicester, the world was already stunned. But what came next was even more unbelievable. DNA analysis has now revealed details that completely rewrite what we thought we knew about this famous king. Historians are left scrambling, experts are speechless, and even longtime admirers of Richard's legacy are reeling from the truth. Was his bloodline broken? Was his identity not what the records claimed? Or did this discovery expose a scandal hidden for centuries? The answers are sparking fierce debate across academic circles and fueling one of the biggest historical controversies of our time. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew about royal history, ancestry, and even the legitimacy of a dynasty, the Lost King's bones. For more than 500 years, the final resting place of Richard III was uncertain. Chronicles told of his death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, the last major clash of the Wars of the Roses. Accounts said his body was taken to Leicester and buried without ceremony at the Grey Friars Friary. Yet over centuries, the friary was dissolved, demolished, and the memory of its exact location faded. By the modern era, the king's grave was thought to be lost forever, perhaps even thrown into a river, as later rumors suggested. That changed in 2012 when archaeologists launched an excavation in Leicester. The unlikely site was a council car park. Research had shown that the friary once stood in that very area, its outlines hidden beneath asphalt and concrete. Few expected that anything would be found, let alone the bones of a king. But within days of digging, a human skeleton was uncovered in the area believed to be the friary's choir, precisely where some records suggested Richard III was buried. The skeleton, referred to at first simply as skeleton number 1, carried features that instantly drew attention. It was the remains of a man in his early 30s, Richard III, who had died at 32. His bones bore the scars of battle, wounds to the skull consistent with blows from swords or halberds, and cuts that suggested his helmet had been removed in the final moments of combat. These matched contemporary accounts of his violent death on the battlefield. Perhaps most telling was the spine. The skeleton displayed severe scoliosis, a curvature that would have caused one shoulder to sit higher than the other. Chroniclers from Richard III's time described him as having uneven shoulders, while later portrayals, especially Shakespeare's, exaggerated this into a grotesque hunchback. The bones revealed that while Richard was not as deformed as legend suggested, he did suffer from a significant condition that would have been noticeable in life. Carbon dating placed the remains firmly in the late 15th century. Chemical testing of isotopes from the teeth showed a rich diet, heavy in meat and fish, fitting for a person of high social rank. The burial site itself strengthened the case. The Grey Friars Friary had long been thought to be Richard III's final resting place, and this skeleton lay exactly where the choir of the friary once stood. Still, archaeologists knew these findings were not enough on their own. The age, the wounds, the scoliosis, the burial place, all fit, but none were absolute proof. For history to accept that Richard III had been found, something stronger was required. The challenge was to connect a skeleton from the 15th century to the present day with undeniable certainty. That certainty, they hoped, could come from DNA. Modern genetics offered a tool that historians of earlier generations could never have dreamed of. The ability to read a genetic signature preserved in bones and compare it to living relatives. If the genetic code in the skeleton matched that of known descendants of Richard III's family, the identification would be far stronger than any physical clue. The search for relatives began. Richard III himself left no direct descendants. His only legitimate son had died in childhood. But scientists could look sideways at the family tree. His mother, Cicely Neville, had many children, including daughters whose descendants stretched into the modern world. Through careful genealogy, researchers identified living people who could be traced directly through the female line, back to Richard III's sister, Anne of York, These individuals carried the same mitochondrial DNA passed unchanged from mother to child. The team also explored the paternal line using the Y chromosome passed down from father to son. Since Richard III had no sons, the scientists turned to descendants of the broader Plantagenet family, particularly from Edward III, Richard's ancestor. If the Y chromosome of the skeleton matched those of the descendants, it would confirm that the remains belonged to a true Plantagenet king. The stage was set. Archaeology had delivered a compelling candidate for Richard III's remains. Now, genetics would be asked to settle the question. The science of a king. Once the skeleton was uncovered, all eyes turned to science. Archaeology had given a strong case. But the world wanted certainty. Could DNA pulled from bones buried for over 500 years truly confirm that this was Richard III? The task was difficult. Ancient DNA is fragile, easily contaminated, and often too degraded to read. Yet, if successful, it could provide the kind of proof that no historical record could match. The first step was understanding what kind of DNA could be useful. Most of our DNA is shuffled with each new generation, half from the mother and half from the father. But two types of DNA travel down family lines almost unchanged: mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. These became the key tools. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is passed from mother to child unaffected by the father's genes. That means all siblings born of the same mother share the same mtDNA, and so do their descendants along the female line. For Richard III, scientists trace this maternal line through his sister Anne of York. After centuries of marriages and migrations, genealogists were able to identify living people who could be linked to Anne through an unbroken line of mothers. Their names were Michael, a furniture maker living in London, and Wendy, a genealogist based in Canada. If the mitochondrial DNA taken from the skeleton matched theirs, it would be powerful evidence that the bones belonged to Richard III. The paternal line presented a different kind of challenge. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son, largely unchanged through the generations. In theory, Richard III's Y chromosome should match that of other men descended directly from the Plantagenet kings. Tracing back through history, scientists looked at Edward III, a distant ancestor. From him, several male lines survived into the modern age. Most notably, the Somerset family, descendants of Henry Somerset, 5th Duke of Beaufort. If their Y chromosomes matched the skeletons, it would add another layer of proof. Collecting DNA from a skeleton that had been underground for centuries was no small task. The remains were carefully handled in controlled laboratories where even a single human hair or skin cell could ruin results. To minimize contamination, scientists worked in sealed rooms, wearing full protective suits. They drilled into the teeth and into dense sections of bone, places most likely to preserve DNA despite the passage of time. From there, tiny fragments of genetic code were extracted, cleaned, and then amplified, copied millions of times so they could be sequenced. It was delicate work. Ancient DNA can break down into short fragments, sometimes only a few dozen base pairs long. Sequencing machines then had to reassemble these fragments into a readable sequence, like piecing together a shredded manuscript. Even then, researchers needed to cross-check results repeatedly to make sure that what they had was authentic genetic code from the skeleton, not contamination from centuries of soil or modern handling. When the mtDNA results were revealed, the evidence was clear. The sequence from the skeleton matched both Michael and Wendy. The odds of such a match happening by chance were tiny. To many, this was the strongest sign yet that the bones in the car park were truly those of Richard III. But DNA has a way of raising as many questions as it answers. When scientists turned to the Y chromosome, the results were unexpected. The skeleton's Y chromosome did not match the men descended from the Somerset line. Instead of confirmation, the test exposed a mystery. Somewhere along the many generations between Edward III and the present, a break had occurred in the male line. In other words, a father recorded in history had not actually been the biological father. This kind of event is called a false paternity event. A polite scientific phrase for what in plain terms means that somewhere in the royal family tree an illegitimate child had been accepted as legitimate. It could have happened in Richard III's line, or in the Somerset line, or anywhere in between. The problem was that it raised uncomfortable possibilities. If the skeleton's Y chromosome did not match, what did that say about the continuity of the Plantagenet line? The discovery set off a wave of speculation. Historians debated where the break might have happened. Was it early in the generations after Edward III, when questions of legitimacy already played into dynastic politics? Or later, perhaps closer to Richard III's own time? Without more DNA samples, the precise point could not be determined. But what was certain was that the royal bloodline, often treated as a sacred thread of continuity, was not as unbroken as many had believed. For the scientists, the mtDNA match was enough to confirm the identity of the skeleton as Richard III. For the public, however, the Y chromosome mystery was a tantalizing twist. It suggested secrets hidden for centuries within one of the most famous dynasties in English history. Far from closing the book, DNA had opened a new chapter. The discovery raised deeper questions. If Richard III's paternal line was uncertain, what did that mean for claims of legitimacy made by later kings? The mystery deepens. When scientists revealed that Richard III's Y chromosome did not match that of his supposed male line descendants, it set off a wave of intrigue. The remains had been identified with strong confidence through mitochondrial DNA, but the paternal line had exposed a gap, a fault line in the royal blood tree. What did it mean? And more importantly, where in the family tree had the break occurred? Historians and geneticists began to trace the problem backwards. The Y chromosome test had involved descendants of Edward III, a monarch who reigned more than a century before Richard III. If the skeleton's Y chromosome failed to match theirs, the break in the line could have happened at any point between Edward's time and Richard's own generation. That left many possibilities, each with very different historical consequences. If the false paternity event occurred early in the line, say, in one of Edward III's many sons or grandsons, then the entire legitimacy of later Plantagenet kings could be thrown into question. In that scenario, Richard III may have been only one in a long series of monarchs whose biological link to Edward was not as advertised. On the other hand, if the break came later, perhaps in the Beaufort line from which the Somersets descended, then the issue might lie not with Richard's branch, but with theirs. Either way, the results suggested that the story of England's royal succession was not as clean as the official records claimed. The phrase used by scientists, false paternity event, may sound neutral, but in plain terms, it points to a scandal. Somewhere at some time, a child had been fathered by a man other than the one listed in the genealogies. Such events were not unheard of, even in noble families. Studies of modern populations suggest that false paternity events occur at rates of around 1 to 2% per generation, over the course of many centuries. That means it would be statistically unusual for a long dynastic line to escape them entirely. Still, to find one exposed in the direct line of England's kings carried heavy symbolic weight. The public response was swift. Newspapers speculated about royal affairs hidden in medieval castles, whispering about betrayals that could have rewritten history. Was this the genetic trace of a queen's infidelity, or a hidden liaison involving a noble woman? Historians cautioned against jumping to conclusions without knowing exactly when the break occurred. There was no way to assign blame, or even to connect it to any recorded event. The result was both thrilling and frustrating. The evidence of a secret was there, but the details remained out of reach. For scholars of the Wars of the Roses, the discovery added another layer of irony. The conflict that consumed Richard III's reign revolved around competing claims to legitimacy. York versus Lancaster, both branches of the Plantagenets. Each side accused the other of being less entitled to the crown. Now, centuries later, DNA suggested that the entire notion of an unbroken royal bloodline was itself flawed. The wars may have been fought over a lineage that, genetically speaking, was never as pure as claimed. The skeleton itself continued to yield clues. Alongside the scoliosis that marked Richard III's posture, the bones showed multiple battle wounds. Cuts to the skull indicated that he had been struck repeatedly after his helmet was removed. Sharp injuries to the pelvis suggested humiliation in death. possibly inflicted as his body was carried from the battlefield. These findings matched written accounts of how Richard had died fighting bravely, but had been mocked after death. The DNA mystery only deepened the sense that his story was more complex than the legend of a villain king created by Shakespeare. At the same time, facial reconstruction based on the skull offered the public a startlingly human image of Richard III, using CT scans. Experts rebuilt his features, producing a face that resembled portraits painted in the years after his death. Combined with the DNA evidence of hair and eye color, suggesting he likely had blue eyes and light brown hair, the image challenged older stereotypes. This was not the hunched, dark villain of the stage, but a real man, whose life and death had left a physical record. Other clues and conflicting evidence. The DNA analysis finally solved the mystery of King Richard III, and it is worse than we thought. Tests had provided the actual proof of what had happened. On one hand, the mitochondrial DNA tied the skeleton directly to Richard III's family, leaving little doubt that the bones were his. On the other hand, the Y chromosome mismatch raised questions that could not easily be answered. But DNA was not the only source of evidence. Other scientific techniques and historical records offered further insight, sometimes supporting the identification, sometimes complicating it. One of the first avenues of investigation was isotopic analysis. By examining the chemical makeup of Richard III's teeth and bones, scientists could build a picture of his diet and where he had lived. Teeth record what a person consumed during childhood, while bones are more reflective of the last decade of life. Results showed a shift from a more modest diet in childhood to one rich in luxury foods as an adult, consistent with Richard's rise in status. The data revealed a man who ate freshwater fish and expensive meats, drank large quantities of wine, and enjoyed imported delicacies. This aligned with the lifestyle of a noble and later a king. Facial reconstruction added another dimension. Using 3D scans of the skull, experts recreated what Richard III likely looked like. The reconstructed face was compared to contemporary portraits, many painted within a generation of his death. The resemblance was striking. The narrow jaw, the high cheekbones, and the determined expression matched well with depictions in the National Portrait Gallery and elsewhere. Yet, DNA also contributed to this portrait. Genetic markers suggested that Richard likely had blue eyes and light brown hair, features that matched early paintings, but not later ones that had darkened his appearance to fit the image of a villain. The physical evidence from the skeleton also helped to separate myth from reality. Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard III as a twisted, deformed tyrant had cemented an image of a hunched figure. The spine, however, told a subtler story. Richard did suffer from severe scoliosis, a sideways curvature that would have made his torso uneven. His right shoulder sat higher than the left, and his ribs were compressed on one side. But he was not the grotesque figure depicted on stage. The condition would have been noticeable, but with custom armor and clothing, he could still function as a capable warrior. Indeed, the wounds on his body showed he fought until the end, even after his helmet was torn away. The injuries revealed during examination painted a brutal picture of Richard III's last moments. Blows to the skull, consistent with halberds and swords, suggested that once unprotected, he was struck down by multiple attackers. Other wounds, including one to the pelvis, hinted at post-mortem humiliation, inflicted after death as his body was carried from the battlefield. These details supported the chronicles that described his final charge, his death surrounded by enemies, and the indignities suffered afterwards. Yet even as these clues strengthened the identification, the Y chromosome mystery lingered. Scientists compared Richard III's Y chromosome to known haplogroups, the broad genetic families of male lineages. He fell into a haplogroup found more rarely in Britain. In contrast, the Somersets carried a haplogroup that is most common in Western Europe. The stark difference confirmed that the mismatch was not a fluke of testing, but a genuine break in the line. The historical implications were unsettling. If the false paternity event occurred in Richard III's direct line, then perhaps his father, Richard of York, was not who history claimed. That would mean Richard III's claim to the throne was genetically broken. On the other hand, If the event occurred later in the Somerset branch, then the problem lay with their claim, not his. The uncertainty kept historians cautious, but the very existence of a break in the male line stirred debate about legitimacy, inheritance, and what it meant to be a king. Aftermath, fallout, next steps. The discovery of Richard III's remains and the subsequent DNA revelation sparked reactions across the worlds of history, science, and public fascination. Museums, universities, and genealogy enthusiasts alike were captivated, while social media buzzed with debates about royal bloodlines, legitimacy, and hidden truths in history. For a king buried under a parking lot, the attention was unprecedented. Centuries after his death, Richard III had become the center of a new historical mystery. Historians praised the discovery for its rigor and significance. The skeletal evidence confirmed details long debated. His age, battle injuries, and scoliosis were consistent with contemporary accounts. Facial reconstructions informed by DNA provided a surprisingly human image of the king, challenging centuries of caricature and legend. The identification of the skeleton also proved that archaeological methods combined with genetic analysis could solve historical puzzles once considered unsolvable. Richard III's story became a model for integrating traditional research with cutting-edge science. Yet the revelation about the male line break sparked more complex debates. For historians of monarchy and lineage, the discovery prompted questions about succession, legitimacy, and the reliability of genealogical records. The idea that the Plantagenet male line may have experienced multiple false paternity events, unsettled, long-held assumptions. Some experts suggest this may point to a recurring pattern in noble families. Appearances and recorded relationships often took precedence over biology, especially when political power was at stake. Others cautioned that the findings, while significant, do not diminish Richard III's role in history. They simply add a new dimension, revealing that human relationships and dynastic politics were far more complicated than the records imply. Public reaction was a mix of fascination and astonishment. Visitors flocked to Leicester Cathedral, eager to see the tomb of a king whose story had been rewritten by science. Royal enthusiasts debated about the implications for claims of Plantagenet descent, while casual readers were drawn to the drama, a king's bones telling secrets that had been hidden for centuries. Genealogists, meanwhile, began considering what these findings meant for living descendants. For those connected through the maternal line, the confirmation of Richard III's identity provided a tangible link to history. For those tracing male line descent, the findings raised questions about the accuracy of traditional family trees. Some saw it as an opportunity to explore other branches, to verify claims using DNA, and to reconsider historical narratives in light of new evidence. Others approached it with caution, mindful that the findings did not indicate wrongdoing by any specific individual, but rather revealed patterns over generations. Finally, there are ethical and philosophical questions. The idea that royal bloodlines may conceal secrets challenges assumptions about heredity, authority, and the nature of legitimacy. It asks us to consider what we value in historical figures, their genes, their actions, or the narratives built around them. Richard III's story shows that even centuries after death, discoveries can provoke reflection on the intersection of science, history, and society. In the end, Richard III's legacy is both confirmed and complicated. His remains have been found, his story retold, and his features reconstructed. Yet the DNA results remind us that history is rarely simple. Some truths emerge slowly, hidden in bones and genes, waiting for modern eyes to uncover them. What other things about Richard III do people not know? Let us know in the comments.